Hi folks, thanks for coming to my channel. So first thing to say here is thank you to subscribers. Thank you for all the feedback that you give. Sometimes, I've probably mentioned this before, sometimes people really put effort into giving quite long feedback. And that's good. I read everything, or I really try to. But apologies if I can't respond in detail to every post. I do read them though, so thanks for that. I have noticed though that most of my subscribers are guys, are men, um, and that's great. But um, I know that I do have some female subscribers. So, ladies, I would like to hear more from you. If you're watching this and you want to give your thoughts, especially on this video, please do. I want to hear what you have to say. I mean, I welcome all contributions. I'm never going to say only these people can comment, but I would like to hear more from my female subscribers. I've got 1,800 subscribers, and whilst most are men, I know that I have a few hundred female subscribers. So please do comment. I want to hear your thoughts as well. Don't be shy. I leave the comment section open for everyone. So please do give me your insight or your perspective, even if it's disagreeing with me. Um, and that's sort of related to this video. Actually, it's about men and women and issues around that. So bear with me because there's a few things to say with this one. I want to talk about chivalry and its meaning today, if it's still valid today, how it's perceived today, and a lot of issues around that because I think it's relevant to social discourse, among other things. Firstly, the word itself, I think it comes from French. Now, I'm not going to get into linguistics because I'll embarrass myself, but I think it's originally a French concept, and it comes from medieval France, but was also used in other parts of medieval Europe, including England and Scotland. Um, and it actually traditionally meant, when we hear chivalry today, we almost immediately think how men treat women. But in medieval Europe, it was very much about God, king, and treating ladies was part of that. How a knight would treat courtly ladies. But bear in mind that was just courtly ladies. That was just noble women. That wasn't peasant women, generally speaking. But God and service to the king were also a very big part of chivalry. And in fact, even how they would treat a fallen enemy was part of chivalry. Um, Actually, there's a lot of misconceptions about the Middle Ages. The truth is, chivalry, I think, has somewhat been distorted because take a Hundred Years' War, for example, there was brutality on both sides, including the English, and these were hard times, um, and it was a pretty cutthroat world. So the idea of knights being always virtuous and chivalrous, it's it's true in a way that was fitting of the context of the time, but perhaps not in the way that we would see it today. So it's an interesting subject to look at from a historical perspective. But thinking of the more modern concept of chivalry, which is entirely about men and women, today we don't think of chivalry as anything to do with God, or in this case, the Queen. We think of it as men and women. Um, so, sometimes we'll hear questions like, is chivalry dead? And then there'll kind of be arguments and counter arguments about it. Firstly, I think we need to think about what chivalry means today. How is it perceived? I think it's perceived as men being polite to women. But if you look at things like holding doors open or giving up your seat on a bus, that's actually more relevant to people who are more vulnerable or perceived to be more vulnerable. So, for example, older people, disabled people, a pregnant woman goes without saying, but I would argue that that's more to do with politeness than chivalry, just basic politeness and basically being a decent person. I think for the most part, the British are quite polite people. I think that stereotype is true to an extent, I think we do value politeness, but there are plenty of Britons who are very rude and very obnoxious and who throw politeness out the window. So it's a natural stereotype that is true to an extent because we do emphasise pleases and thank yous and etiquette. On the other hand, you know, anyone who thinks that the British or the Castle of Downton Abbey will get a nasty surprise if they went into any housing estate, or for that matter, without being classist. They could go into the City of London and see the sort of really laddish culture that you might get with city traders. It's anything but polite. Um, so, there's definitely another side of the British which can be quite the opposite. After all, this was a country that was notorious for hooliganism in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, to the point where it got so bad it was called the British disease. Um, why I'm tapping that into this conversation is because chivalry is something that's often tied to European culture, Western culture. Actually, I asked when I was in China. I asked a friend of mine. She was a colleague, and her English was very good, so we could have conversations like this. I asked her was there a Chinese equivalent, and she said there actually was. She told me the word in Chinese. I forget now, but that ostensibly came from Chinese history. Um, so there's probably an equivalent in most societies. Chivalry just happens to be a European word, but there probably is an equivalent in most societies. And this is something that feminists overlook throughout history, and it's something actually Will Nolan mentioned in his lecture. Throughout history, men have actually risked their lives to protect women. Throughout history, in pretty much every society. This is something feminists massively overlook. When they say that society is controlled by men and men have always been the warmongers, they overlook the fact that men have also always been the protectors. Um, in ancient warfare, you may have some examples of women warriors, but that's more an exception than the norm. It did happen. There were examples, both in ancient Greece and in other parts of the world, but it definitely was the exception more than the norm. Almost universally, the warriors, the protectors, were men. And if they weren't, that would have been unthought of. It's only in the 20th century, really, that the pacifist philosophy started coming into play, and even then, it was a huge risk. You know, the way that I don't want to divulge here, but I'll just mention this briefly. The way that soldiers were handed white feathers during World War One, or rather, young men were handed white feathers if they were perceived to not be doing their duty, and specifically, they were handed white feathers by women, not by men, by women, specifically to shame them. Like you're not being a real man. You're not standing up for king and country. You're not ostensibly with that protecting your women folk. Because a big part of the recruitment drive of World War One was the rape of Belgium. Now, I think that atrocities did occur in Belgium, um, but a big part of that push was men of Ireland, men of England, would you allow this to happen? And it was very much a recruiting drive. So that's just one example. Throughout history, men have fought to protect women. That's a fact. It's also true that men in wars have hurt women. We've seen that especially in modern conflicts like the DRT, and especially during World War II when mass rape was very widespread. Um, but the fact of the matter is, there is strong empirical evidence that throughout history men have fought to protect women. It's something that feminists ignore. Um, And men didn't always have a choice about that because if they didn't, they would have been shamed as cards. I saw, and this was in every society. I saw a documentary. I think it was a Ken Burns documentary on the Wild West. It was very extensive, a lot of ins and outs to it. But one thing that was interesting was one of the Native American tribes. I think it was the Pawnee, but don't quote me on that. There was an interesting quote that they had to have courage to face the enemy. They had to, be real warriors to face the enemy. But it took an even braver warrior or brave to go back and face the women, the wrath of the women, if they turned back. That's interesting. So this sort of attitude has existed throughout history, and feminists, they downplay it. They'll say, "Oh well, men always had the power, so men dictate the terms." But women did play a role in that sense. They may not have had voting rights, but they definitely played a role in that sort of propaganda. Having said that, though, I have to point out that in World War One, the suffragette movement was very divided on the war. There were conservative suffragettes who were pacifist socialist suffragettes, so there was divisions in that area. Um, I didn't really intend to go into all that, but I do think it's relevant to this actually. Um, so today, what is chivalry? I'll recount an experience I had, and this would be an example of someone being helped out that has nothing to do with men and women. When I was leaving China the first time around, this is 2013, I was in the city of Guangzhou. It's a massive city, one of the biggest cities in the world. It's about the third biggest city in China by population. Anyway, I had heavy luggage. I had to get to the airport. I had left enough time, so I was in the city for about 4 or 5 hours. But it really is a big city, so trying to travel across the city, I also had to have lunch, and I met some young guys. Now I trusted them because they were students, and if you've been in China enough, you start to get an idea of who you can trust and who you can't. Generally, young people, students, are trustworthy because when they offered help, it's not a scam. You can believe them, at least in my experience. So these young guys offered to help me get to the airport because I wasn't 100% sure about the stations. I kind of had an idea. But anyway, the time was okay, but the train was going quite slow. This was the metro system. It was chugging along. It was very packed. I was getting a little bit anxious at this point because I knew I needed at least an hour in the airport. So, I'm sure anyone else who's been in this situation will know what I'm talking about. I had heavy luggage. It was a hot day, quite stressful. And I was genuinely getting quite nervous because there was still quite a lot of people between me and the door. So these young guys, they said, just go out. We will push this over. That was a bit of a risk, but I thought I'm going to have to do something here. I can't do this myself. So I kind of went out, and they literally passed my case over the people's heads, a bit like the scene in Crocodile Dundee. Had they not done that, you know what metro trains are like the world over. They give you maybe 30 seconds when the doors are open. Um, had they not done that, I could very well have missed that stop and very possibly missed my flight. So was that chivalry? No, it was just young guys seeing, um, a foreigner and they wanted to help. And it was an act of decency. And I have to say, for all the things I say about China, I stand by them. However, the Chinese people, generally speaking, are very helpful and hospitable to foreigners. That's my own experience. Unless, there's a misunderstanding. But they will. People that young people, they will go out of the way to help you. That's sincere. That is something I experienced. That's one of the positive things I would say about the Chinese as a characteristic. They're helpful people in that sense. But it's not chivalry because it's they were young guys. I'm a guy. Um, Another experience in China. This was the last time I was there in 2018. I was on a high speed train. It was going from the city of yeah, it was directly from Kaili to Zhengzhou. Zhengzhou's a big city in the north. Kaili was a small provincial city that I was in. It was a long journey, 8 hours, even on high speed. But basically, two young women got on and they had heavy cases. And they were kind of struggling. And the other people in the vicinity were older people or children, So I kind of was watching them and I sort of nodded, like, you know, um, why not? I've got two arms and two legs. So I lifted their baggage up and put it in the overhead compartment. It was quite heavy. I don't know how they got it there, but there was no real communication. I speak very limited Chinese. They obviously couldn't speak English, but they smiled and nodded. They obviously knew what the gesture was. Now, was I white knighting? Was I trying to, because they were attractive young women? No, I would have helped anyone. If that had been an old guy, I would have helped him as well. Um, and what I find is it's just a case of, well, I'm a quite strong young guy. Yeah. Well, why just sit there? it would be a pretty shitty thing to do to watch someone struggling and just watch them. Um, Now we get into the context of dating and that sort of thing. In fact, I can cite a lot of anecdotes because they're all relevant. This one isn't about dating. This is about a female friend of mine. So about 7 years ago, I invited her over with other friends. You know, it wasn't just her, because I wanted to thank them. They'd supported me in my charity boxing event. Now they weren't British, um, so they didn't know my city well. She was Chinese, in fact. And you know, we were playing games and stuff with the family. It was around Christmas time, and it was getting late. Buses had stopped running, and the taxi lines were just really busy, really booked. I don't drive, so you know, there were several options. She had something to do the next day. She had to get up early. I would have proposed like, well, we have a spare room. Why don't you stay over? But she didn't want to do that. She had something to prepare. So I'm thinking, okay, I really don't want her walking home alone. Sunderland's not a particularly dangerous city, but you know, we have our share of drunks and troublemakers. So I just offered to walk home with her. Now this was about, it was quite a trek. It was close to 2 miles, I would say. But you know, I knew the route well, and I really didn't want to have it on my mind, always thinking, is she safe? Is she safe? Because I know what some people in the city are like. Young Chinese woman on her own at night time, you know, you will get potentially people harassing her. So I walked home with her. And when we got there, she thanked me and said goodnight, and that was it. I walked back. Quite a nice route anyway by the sea coast. Um, Now, was I being chivalrous? I don't know. Would I call that chivalry? I would say it was just being a good friend, being a decent person. Honestly, would I offer the same thing for a guy? Probably not. What I would do with a male friend is say, all right, mate, just let me know when you get back safely. You know, give me a call or something. But yes, there is a different dynamic with men and women. I wouldn't offer to walk a male friend home unless maybe he didn't know the way, and then I'd go with him to kind of show him the direction. But I wouldn't walk him home to protect him in the same way. The fact of the matter is, men are physically stronger than women. The average man is physically stronger than the average woman. This is not to say that just because I was there, there wouldn't have been any hassle. You know, we could still have hassle, but you know, her being on her own, that was not something I wanted to risk. So I kind of, yeah, she accepted it anyway. Now, if she'd been the sort of woman to really, really be headstrong and say, no, I'm a strong, independent woman, no, no, don't do that, would I have forced it? Probably not. I would have said, okay, I think it's a mistake, but please at least text me when you get back. So I think there is a male understanding and a female understanding about these things. And, you know, not everyone is the same. Some women will take it at face value, especially if they know someone. I totally understand, by the way, like strangers. But I think with guys that you know, family members, friends, I would say if you know him, take it at face value because most guys are decent. Most guys have decent intentions. Um, so anyway, that's just another anecdote. And there's many where that came from. I've also had misunderstandings, incidentally, but that's you know, I'm just aware of the video time here. So, like I say, people are different. Not all women are the same. Not all men are the same. And I think you get two kind of hardline views with this. On one hand, you get the really hardline feminist view, which is I'm a strong, independent woman. I can look after myself. And if a man offers help, then it's either he's being patronising or he just wants to have sex. Granted, there may be some men that do have that better intention, but more often than not, it's because the man's being just being decent. So that's one hard line approach. But then you get some guys who are now turning this around, and it's probably like the men going their own way group, people like that. They would say, oh, equality, you know, let's throw chivalry out the window completely. Well, I understand where they're coming from because they're taking the view if feminists are going to, you know, see it as patronizing anyway, then why bother? If you're going to be misunderstood. However, what I would contend is, well, okay, there's those situations, but how about a date? How about a date? I mean, for me, chivalry in a date is romantic. So if I'm on a date with a young lady, I am going to treat her really well because I want her to feel special. I'm not going to, really, I'm not going to bend over backwards, so to speak, for her every whim. It's not like that. But I'm quite romantic. I would want to treat her in a nice way. I would pay for the meal. On that issue of payment, again, that's something that is, if the woman really insisted on it, I would say, well, okay, I'm not going to argue against that. But if she doesn't bring it up, then I'm paying. Um, if we went on several dates and I kept paying, it wouldn't really be a problem unless I thought that she was taking me for granted. Then it might be an issue. Or she was stringing me along because that's not cool, whoever is the target. But on a date, I'll pay for the meal. I will bring her chair out. If it's a cold night, I'll offer her my coat. I'll make sure she gets home safely. Um, am I a bit old fashioned, perhaps? But I'm not so old fashioned that I'm stiff. I'm like every other man. Of course, I would like it to develop after a while. And yeah, I'm a man. Of course, I would like an intimate relationship, to put it that way. I would start being suspicious if it was like probably a long time and nothing was happening. I would think, well, look, what's going on here? Do you like me or not? Because I do think a relationship without intimacy, and I'm sure women feel the same way, a relationship without intimacy, what is it? Then it's just a friendship. What if there isn't intimacy at some point, you do start wondering what's going on. I believe that. Um, but yeah, to those guys who say, throw chivalry out completely, well, do you not want a bit of romance on a date? Do you not want to, you know, because men and women are different. Do you not want to feel like you're the gentleman, you are the guy? I don't understand that. Um, but like I say, people are individuals. To me, I would judge a woman based on her attitude. If she's the sort of woman to say, thanks, but no thanks, I'll accept that, and that's fine. If she gets uptight about it and misunderstands it, then that would be a big turn off. Because I would think, well, yeah, she's just a hardline feminist. Because no matter what I say or do, she's going to interpret it a certain way. Whereas you could have a woman who wants to be quite self-independent, and I've really no issue with that. In fact, if she offers to pay for herself, good, saves me money. But I think that could be very respectful and mutual as well. But if she wants to be treated like a lady, I'm going to do that. I'm not going to turn that down. And in return, what would I expect? I just expect her to respect me. That's all. It's not like a bargain, like, oh, if I treat you really well, you have to accept me. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's about mutual sort of, yeah, mutual respect. That's all. That's all it is. So, ladies, if a guy, and he's someone that you know, or you're on a date with, if he offers to be a gentleman, don't turn it down. Or if you really, really do want to be independent, that's okay. But at least turn him down nicely. Just say, well, thanks, I prefer to do it myself or something like that. If he pushes it, then he's being rude. But it's in the end of the day, it's about mutual respect. And I think feminists think it's a one-way street, or too many feminists do, rather. Not all feminists, but I do think that they need to understand that they're on one hand, they're saying to men we're strong and independent, and on the other hand, oh, men have to improve, men need to step up. Frankly, I think a lot of guys are thinking, what are we supposed to do? It's like walking on eggshells. Um, and with recent events that's happened in London, I don't need to explain that. I think there is a very unfortunate atmosphere has developed whereby women feel scared and men are being stigmatized. Like this idea that all men should be accountable for bad men is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. That's like saying all Muslims should be answerable to Islamist extremists. It's absurd. It's an absurd proposition. So I don't like the way that's kind of developed, and I think some people are pushing an agenda with this. Anyway, 25 minutes. I'll round this up. Summed up, I believe in equality. I believe in treating men and women equally as a broad perspective. So, for example, if a woman commits a crime, she should serve the same sentence as a man. In that sense, I'm quite, I'm quite clear on that. But in terms of chivalry, I'm not entirely against it because I think it's romance. I've no problem with doing that. I don't think it's a hardship on me. It's no one's forcing me to do it. But I just think that if I'm on a date, I want her to feel special. I want her to have a good time. I want to have a good time as well, obviously. Um, and I would hope that she would be respectful of me. There's obviously red flags, and everyone would have these. Women would have red flags with certain kinds of guys as well. If he was always talking about sex or something like that, obviously that's a warning sign. But for guys, I think one thing would be, is she going to take me for granted? If I do really try to be a decent boyfriend and be romantic and listen to her and all the rest of it, and then she kind of strings me along. Because again, this idea that why do men always cheat? Well, why do people cheat? Why do women cheat? You know, I get tired of these generic attacks on men, especially when it's on gender neutral things. Right. I think I'll definitely have to leave it there. I've said a lot with this one, but I think it's all interesting and relevant. Let me know your thoughts, and please, please, if you're a woman, I want to hear your perspective, even if you're disagreeing with me. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me what I've misunderstood, and maybe we'll still disagree. But I want to hear your perspective. Thanks for watching.